I'm glad that we had a children's sermon. That is a beautiful, hopeful gift. Thank you for having that, and thank you guys for coming, and thank you, Shifra, for braving to coming out after you injured your shoulder while playing in the snow in Canada. So we're here to talk this morning. This is the end of our series on kind of Mennonite values, and wondering what does it mean to be a Mennonite witness in Atlanta. And what I thought I wanted to do to end this series, but also kind of have us pivot towards Advent, is to just have us wonder about it's the so what question. Like we've spent all these weeks talking about what we believe. Right? We believe that Jesus is the center of our faith. We believe that community is the center of our life. We believe that reconciliation and peace and justice are the center of our vocation. And today's question is, so what? And then Advent is the invitation to wonder, now what? So what? So what does it mean that we say that Jesus is the center of our faith? So what does it mean that we say that community is the center of our life? So what does it mean that we stand for peace and justice and nonviolence in this time, in this age? So what? Diana Butler Bass wrote this. She wrote that by 2070, Christianity in the United States, and this is the whole thing, all forms of Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy, all racial and ethnic Christian communities in a single category, by 2070, will be a minority faith in a nation with a majority of nones. N-O-N-E-S, nuns. She continues, I hope people will listen. Demographics are not destiny. Trends are not predestination. Although Christianity probably will be a minority faith in a much more pluralistic nation in the next few decades, those of us who are Christians still have work to do to advance in advance of that huge historic shift. And hear this, denial is a terrible strategy. Nostalgia is a dangerous choice. Letting the future take its own course is a kind of surrender of responsibility. So let me bring Butler Bass's questions closer to home. What will be the shape of Atlanta Mennonite Church in 2070? In a more pluralistic Atlanta. How will we welcome how different it will be, or will we fight it? How will Atlanta Mennonite Church be a part of the problem? Will Atlanta Mennonite Church be a part of the problem of our political future, or contribute to the flourishing of a pluralistic society and a pluralistic democracy? Today's text is often used to talk about living water. It's often used to talk about who are the right worshipers. And it's often used to focus on the theme where Jesus talks about worshiping in spirit and in truth. But today I want to take it in a completely different direction, a new direction, one that we will only stop at the question or the statement that Jesus makes before offering living water. And the first is this. The first is that the text says, and Shifra, I was wondering about this. Shifra, I got a question for you. Shifra, why did you go to Banff? Because your dad had worked there. All right, that sounds a lot like why Jesus had to go through Samaria. So you had to go to Banff. You didn't really have a choice. Not too many people here had to go to Banff. I've never been to Banff. Anyone here ever been to Banff? I don't even know, never even heard of it. BANFF, correct? Yes, there we go. All right, and it's in which province in Canada? Alberta? That's what I thought. Yeah, all right, okay. So Shiphrah had to go to Banff. Well, this says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, we know that culturally, Jesus would never have had to have gone through Samaria. The Samaritans and the Jews were enemies with one another. And the idea of Jesus having to go through was very countercultural. As a matter of fact, most Jews would have actually taken an extra circuitous route. They would have taken extra days just so as to not have to go through Samaria. So when it says that Jesus had to go, it's because Jesus' heavenly parent said, I've got something that you need to be about. There was some divine purpose in Jesus' adventure and journey through Samaria. With the coming changes that are happening in our country, we are seeing this. I say this all the time. There isn't a single denomination that isn't seeing a decline in growth, and the only thing that's stopping denominations from hemorrhaging are immigrant congregations. So what will Atlanta Mennonite Church look like in 2070? Will it be mostly a Garifuna congregation in this space? Will it be Garifuna and African and South American and who knows where else? What will it look like? How we respond is going to be very indicative. If we look at the lens of this, instead of saying, we are the ones who are Jesus, we are the ones who have to go through Samaria, what if we are Samaria? And what if it's the immigrant Christian who's having to come here? My friend Blake Ortman at Jubilee Partners says that today's immigrant church is the prophetic church of the United States. It has something to speak to us. Many of us come from a colonized Christianity where we feel as though we are the ones that bring Jesus. And the invitation is to wonder. Wherever there is growth happening within the North American church, what is God saying? But Jesus had to go through Samaria. Notice the next thing that it says, that Jesus going through Samaria, he was tired out by his journey. I love that. I love that we get to see in this passage about Jesus a very human Jesus. A Jesus that sounds very much like an American. They always ask people, as an American, how you doing? Busy, tired, worn out, burned out, right? Now, this is a different type of worn out. He was worn out by his journey, worn out by his vocation. But it's still something that I think is really, really telling for us. Because I find that even though I want to say I'm an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist Christian, right? Even though I want to say all those things about me, I can still also go through the litany of things that have me worn out, have me tired, have me busy. Even though I try to prioritize, and I would say that my busyness is filled with things that have a different sense of value, I still find myself trapped in that cycle of busyness. And so I often hear that the North American church is the filling station. I often hear that this is where people come. I don't hear that here, but in my life of being a North American Christian, I often hear people say that Sunday morning is their filling station to get them through the rest of the week. Now, when I lived in LaGrange, we didn't have to worry about environmental issues the same way we have to in a metropolitan area. So you didn't have to get your car checked for its emissions. I wonder what it would look like more to think of not this place as a filling station, but as a diagnostics center. Like, what would it look like if when we were here and gathered together, we actually said, let's look under the hood. How are you doing? What spiritual practices are nourishing you? What check engine lights are coming on in you? Perhaps the most prophetic thing, right? There's an Atlanta writer who talks about, how rest is resistance. That perhaps one of the most radical things that Christians can do is simply rest. And she has the nap ministry. Like she has gatherings where Christians or seekers come together and take naps together and wonder how just resting and pausing can be one of the most countercultural, radical things that we can do, especially as a black woman. She's saying that black bodies have always been made to do the heavy labor and to always be worn out. And so what she says is to see a black woman resting is an act of resistance. I remember this. I remember, I lived 26 years in LaGrange. So I got to see a lot of what the vestiges of what the Cotton South was like. And I remember finding one of the old annual kind of reviews of the Callaway Mills, the big cotton mills that dominated in LaGrange, that built LaGrange, and seeing a photo of black workers on top of a huge bale, like truckload of cotton, and they used the term pickaninnies. And I remembered that usually pickaninnies in a racist vernacular is tied with the word lazy, and yet seeing how worn out they were. So diagnostics would be finding out what's beneath our being worn out, our being tired by our journeys. Being a congregation that is relevant or irrelevant, whichever way you want to look at that, to this rat-pace driven culture would be that we would check in with each other in this space and say, how are you resting? Where is your well? And notice that Jesus finds Jacob's well. It's in enemy territory. It's in the middle of the day, and yet he finds a place to rest. And so for many of us, again, North American Christianity is all about consumerism. We're wrapped and tied into it. So we think of rest and Sabbath as going to a spa, of going to a silent retreat where we pay a few $100. This is my kind of thing to do, pay a few $100 to go on a silent retreat. It was in the pandemic that I realized, I could just drive my Subaru up to the North Georgia mountains and find solitude and silence for free. What a gift. I think that this is a glimpse of what a church of the future could look like. I have no idea if it would be a church of 750, a church of 75, or a church of 7.5. But I do know that this is a society that by 2070 will be so connected to these. We're already cyborgs, right? Already cyborgs. I think I remember reading that no one is ever more than 50 feet away from their phones. Anyone leave their phone at home? Woo, Eleanor. There you go. You and Charlotte would be like. We need to be creative in finding our wells. We need to be a community that says if Christ is the center of our faith, that we care enough for each other to wonder with one another, how are we really doing in our souls? How are we taking care of our souls? I think you all know that when I taught in academia, it was great for my resume. It opened up lots of opportunities to get grants and do research and travel. But no one ever wanted to visit my house. No one ever really wanted to get to know me until we started to live a very radically different way and started to live with immigrants. There is something that about even just small scale experiments with truth that is quite attractive to a post-Christian world. And I think that in the future, that is what will make Mennonitism, whatever we call that, Anabaptism, relevant and attractive. is when we find new experimental ways of living into those three key radical beliefs of Christ being the center of our faith, community being the center of our life, and peace and justice and reconciliation being the center of our vocation. So, while Jesus is worn out by his journey and sitting by a well, thinking he'd like to have a little peace and quiet and a little solitude, in comes the Samaritan woman. And I don't understand this. Maybe there's something culturally that I'm just missing, right? It sounds more like a command, but we look at it as a question. Jesus says, "Give me a drink." Right? In the South, we would never tell someone, "Give me a drink." That sounds way too direct. I can't even say that to Charlotte, right? Imagine, if I just said, "Give me a drink," that would be way off base. So we are Christians. We are carriers of Christ. We are the water bottles of Christ. But what if, instead of that triumphal and colonizing Jesus, what if the Christ that we bring out into the world is the vulnerable one? Notice what Jesus is doing here. Like we rush to the part about Jesus offering living water, but it starts with a Jesus who is worn out by his journey, and somehow that's documented and known. And we see a Jesus who makes his own needs known and is vulnerable even to someone outside of his community. I think that the church of the future, if it's going to have any relevance to 21st century United States, is it's going to be a church that is vulnerable. It's not going to be the one with all the bells and the whistles and all the flashy things. It's going to be a church of people that are authentic and vulnerable. You all know that Cody Norris preached here a few months ago in September when we had our Seasons of Creation series. And Cody, for those of you who weren't here or don't connect the name, is the director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. I'm hoping to go on a retreat with Cody in a couple of weeks. It's not costing me anything. That's a very Mennonite thing. Plus, again, it's kind of finding my own well. See, it works out. Our frugality, we can rationalize that. So as Mennonites. But one of the things that I'm still impressed by is that, if you remember, Cody lived here. Cody helped build the barn. Cody then, went to completed seminary and now leads Georgia's, main organization engaging faith communities in sustainability. And Cody said to me, we're past the tipping point when it comes to climate change. Like, we can keep trying to encourage congregations to reduce, reuse, recycle, change their light bulbs, go to solar power. We can try to do all those type things, but the church has a bigger mission now. And what he's talking about is churches that are resiliency hubs. Churches that know how to be neighborly, how to love their neighbors in the midst of climate change. Churches that would have be able to generate power so that when we have the brownouts and our neighbors need their medicine refrigerated, or they don't have ways to keep their food, that we could love our neighbors in those types of ways, that we could be off the grid so that we could be of service to this neighborhood. That's a position of vulnerability, not just of opportunity. That's a position of saying that we thirst, that we collectively have failed. We are thirsty. We don't know the answers, but we'll reach out across lines, across denominational lines, across faith lines, across out and reach out to the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and say, we don't know the answer, but what we have here is humble, and what we have here we're willing to discern on how it can be used to glorify God and to be of service to our neighbors. So when Jesus does that, when Jesus reaches out in vulnerability to someone completely different from him, the person is not understanding, and they're trapped in that cultural mindset of still trying to just figure out, what is it that you're doing? You're not supposed to even be talking to me. I'm a woman, I'm a Samaritan, I'm shunned by my society. I mean, she can't get past all of the cultural scripts. And Jesus is just reaching out in raw honesty and vulnerability. And she can't get past all of that. And so Jesus makes the one most prophetic statement of this passage that I think often gets overlooked, and so I like to stop here. Jesus simply says, if you knew the gift, if you knew the gift. Atlanta Mennonite Church, we can get lost in wondering what the future of Atlanta Mennonite Church is going to be. I invited us by starting by thinking out 47 years into the future, when Shifra is pastor. But the reality is that in a society that often has us thinking so future-oriented, what we don't realize is that the choices that we make now will determine what kind of church we will have 47 years in the future. The choices that we make now will determine how people view us now. And so my invitation in closing here is just to remind us that if we knew the gift, if we had the radical hospitality that Jesus has, if we walked with real humility like Jesus walked, if we had risky honesty like Jesus modeled in this passage, and if we have a resilient hope, we can get glimpses of the gift that this congregation is, that this place is, that everything that God has invited us to steward. We can have a real sense of the gift of what this is. And so that's why we pivot now towards Advent, and we wonder, if we knew the gift of God and who it was saying to us, give me a drink, how would that radically shift the way we become church? Amen.